Well, Spina, I've really gained a lot of knowledge about Guatemala. This is my first trip to your country. But honestly, it has not been on the radar, as we say in the U.S. Most of the information that we have about Guatemala is negative because of the migration, the perception of crime and corruption. And so I've been wanting to get down here to visit the country and see for myself and learn as much as I can, because I think there's great potential for relationships between the United States and Guatemala. I think you're in a position strategically to be a very important ally of the United States and to address some of the issues that we're having to deal with, whether it's migration or China's influence in the region or just economics. And so I'm looking forward to the next couple of days that I'm here and hopefully to a return visit.
And as a follow-up question on the subject you just touched, what do you think has been the impact on the U.S. economy from migration? How do you think the U.S. and Guatemala can manage that situation in a more aggressive manner?
Well, one of the things that I've focused on is trying to help Latin American countries develop the energy infrastructure that they need to support manufacturing and a growing economy. I grew up very poor in America. Most people think everybody in America is very wealthy. My father was basically uneducated, had about an 8th grade education. He was a logger. I grew up going into the woods with my father in the summer, skidding logs with mules. Kind of tells you how old I am. But I also understood that we needed wealthy people, business owners, to create opportunity for the rest of us. I'm the first person in my family to go to college, but I was able to go to college by working during the summer for companies. So I was very appreciative of the fact that someone who had the wealth was willing to take the risk to start a company that could give me a good paying job that helped me pay my way through college. So I see some of the similarities of where I grew up, which was a very poor region. Just 40 years ago when I was growing up, it was considered one of the most poverty-stricken areas in the state of Alabama. And to see things today and how they've changed, because we were able to bring essential things like power, energy, which would support manufacturing. So some guy who had the capital resources could actually start a company. So those are some of the things that I look at in your region in Guatemala is how do we work together to help Guatemala build out its energy infrastructure, create an environment for private investment, not government investment, because private investment is a relationship that will last decades where governments come and go. And so that's one of the things that I'm hoping to initiate in terms of the relationship between the United States and really in the Western Hemisphere, where other people will look at Guatemala and other countries in the region as great places to invest in the private sector so that you build a growing economy, create a thriving middle class. It's beneficial for everyone.
Congress Palmer, it seems that those things that worked during those decades to promote growth in the U.S., in the whole world, in the region, have stopped doing them since a couple of decades ago. Green energy has been one of the main concerns in the whole world, and those developments have stagnated in the recent years. So do you believe there has been a shift in the policy priorities in the whole world, in the U.S., in our region, that have, in a certain way, not promoted this economic growth that has been the basis of what you're talking about in your experience?
First of all, Jose, I think you're talking about the whole climate change agenda.
Yeah.
And how they've made this an international crisis, which it really isn't. And I'll use some different ways to illustrate this. We had a hearing, and we had someone from the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration as a witness, and then the director of scientific affairs from the State Department there. And when it came my turn to ask the questions, I asked them a very simple question. Has the Sahara always been a desert? And most people would think, well, of course, it's always been a desert. Well, it's only been a desert about 4,000 or 5,000 years. That's like yesterday in the geologic time scale. So if it's only been a desert for 4,000 or 5,000 years, then you have to ask yourself what caused it to become a desert, because prior to that, there were wetlands, there were streams, there were woodlands, there was agriculture, there were Nubian and Egyptian settlements there. Archaeologists are excavating those today. Well, most scientists believe the Earth changed its tilt on its axis, changed the wind patterns in the region, and over about a 10 or 12,000 year period, the Sahara became a desert. Now, and if you apply modern thinking to this, what could they have done to adapt to that? They could have adopted the modern desalination technology that Israel uses and irrigation, and they'd still be farming in the Sahara. In my own state of Alabama, on the Gulf Coast, 10 miles off the coastline in the Gulf of Mexico, are the remains of an ancient cypress forest. Okay? That obviously the coastline was much farther out at that time period when these cypress forests were very healthy forests grew. Well, that's climate change. And it's the things that we can't stop, but we can use our technology and our engineering expertise to adapt to and mitigate. And in terms of what is being pushed, the green energy, as I think I mentioned that I worked for 2 international engineering companies. One was in environmental systems. We built the equipment to eliminate air pollution, things like that. I can tell you that we do not have the ability to get to net zero by 2050. The physics don't work and the finances don't work. It will impoverish nations like Guatemala. What you need to help your people prosper is advances in energy production. I think on the front end you should do it with natural gas. U.S. natural gas has 42% less air pollutants than Russian gas, for instance. But over the long haul, eventually it'll be small modular nuclear reactors. They have 0 carbon emissions. You can site them on a very small area. They're almost portable. They will operate 60 to 80 years. But if you tried to do that with provide your power needs, your electricity needs with a turbine farm to get the same production as you could get from 2 small modular reactors, which would, I know you talk in hectares, we talk in acres. You could put 2 small nuclear reactors on 640 acres. It takes 77,000 acres for 1 turbine farm, and they'll only operate 25 to 30 years. So the physics don't work. And I'm really more focused on what I think is a political agenda than a real climate agenda.
And what can we do regarding that specific subject, since, let's say, for example, nuclear energy has gone down in the whole world, mainly in Europe. Solar panels have gone up and wind farms as well. So what can we do in countries like the U.S. and countries like ours in Guatemala to promote this type of investments? It's been really tough or really difficult for our country, which can produce natural gas, to develop infrastructure projects related to the exploitation of this type of energy. What can we learn from other experiences, and how can we promote policies focused on this type of investments?
A couple of things. One, France, 70% of their power is from nuclear, and France has done it the right way. Their nuclear facilities are standard design, which increases safety, but it also reduces cost. Going to the small modular reactors, you can build a lot of components of that in a factory. You can do your testing, a lot of your testing in factories, but you use a standard design and you build enough of them, your cost comes down significantly, and that's really the way to go. The thing about natural gas is our technology is improving almost on a daily basis for reducing emissions from natural gas, for capturing methane emissions as well, which you can use methane. You don't have to burn it. You don't have to just capture it. You can use it for feedstock for other products. And we're never going to give up natural gas completely, because natural gas is 80% of the cost of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. That's the fertilizer your farmers use to produce the food to feed your country. It is the fertilizer that feeds the world. Over 90% of the feedstock for pharmaceuticals is natural gas. So you're never going to do away with it. It is a complete misrepresentation by the folks pushing climate change that you can go to eliminate all fossil fuel. That's not going to happen, because practically everything you've come in contact with in this studio today has some component of hydrocarbon substance in it. But I think what we're dealing with is something that's going to do enormous harm to people worldwide. There are about 4 million people every year die from indoor air pollution because they're having to cook their food with wood indoors, or cow dung, or some other combustible material. That's 4 million per year. There's somewhere in the range of about 2.5 to 3 billion people who have less access to electricity than your average refrigerator uses in a year, and about 800 million who have zero access to power. I don't think we're going to be able to tell those people, well, we're going to save the planet, but you're going to die from inhaling fumes from cooking indoors. That's not going to work. So as these countries like Guatemala are building out an economic future for their country, they're not going to be denied access to the energy that they need to do that.
It seems that the whole green energy flag and sustainability has been used as a double weapon, a political weapon to stagnate the energy sector. And you tackle those issues in Congress. What are your key learnings that maybe we can use in Guatemala to address those concerns, as the current administration has taken a terrible precedent in canceling some mining licenses and negative impact on the energy sector? What can we do to forthcome those challenges?
Well, all of the West has become too dependent on China for the critical minerals and the rare earth elements that you have to run an economy, but you absolutely have to have them for renewable energy. You cannot make a turbine, a generation facility without critical minerals and rare earth elements. You can't make them without enormous amounts of cement, enormous amounts of steel, enormous amounts of plastic, and you can't make plastic without petrochemicals. Same thing is true with solar panels. Right now, China controls 70% of the cobalt mining. You can't make batteries without cobalt. Lithium is a huge issue. Graphite. I could go on down the line, nickel and manganese and remember, I work for 2 international engineering companies and ran a think tank, so I tend to get into the weeds, the details on these things. But it's extremely important that people understand that there are details. There are key details that they need to understand about that's going to drive the direction of our countries. And like I said, we're almost totally dependent on China for these critical minerals. We don't do the processing here. We're not doing the mining like we should, but once we do mine the aggregate, it has to be processed. And then what's processed has to be refined so that you can make something out of it. And we can have factories here that make microchips and semiconductors, but if we don't have the critical minerals or the rare earth elements to make the components, all we're doing is assembling things from parts we get from China.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Congressman, we're going to go to a little break and we're going to return to that idea. Vamos a ir a un pequeño corte comercial y regresamos en esta entrevista especial que estamos teniendo en esta ocasión aquí por Canal Antigua.
alegría, música y actividades culturales, celebramos en el Festival Olímpico a nuestros atletas, quienes llevaron a Guatemala a lo más alto con su esfuerzo y dedicación. Nuestra bandera ondeó con orgullo gracias a las medallas de Adriana Ruano y Jean-Pierre Brol. Para honrar su legado, el presidente Arévalo anunció la construcción de 4 ciudades deportivas, reafirmando el compromiso con el deporte para que más niños de todo el país sueñen en grande.
Día a día, minuto a minuto, se genera importante información alrededor del mundo. La cobertura de los conflictos sociales, indicadores económicos, decisiones políticas. El Mundo, a las 8 p.m., de lunes a viernes.
El Mundo, a las 8 p.m., de lunes a viernes, solo por Canal Antigua. En el IRTRA, lo que soñamos lo construimos. Desde alojamientos diferentes hasta un parque acuático reconocido en el mundo. Desde el primer día estamos trabajando para seguir haciendo posible la tierra del sí se puede. Un lugar donde la imaginación se construye y los sueños suceden. Porque en el IRTRA, lo que soñamos, lo construimos. IRTRA es felicidad. Sé parte de la conversación de la actualidad nacional. Sigue el perfil de ex Canal Antigua y obtén noticias al instante. Entrevistas exclusivas y cobertura en profundidad de los eventos que moldean nuestro país. Mantente informado y genera opinión pública. Búscanos como @Canal Antigua.
Prepárate para reír y ser retado en Decilo, el lugar donde todas las opiniones cuentan, donde hablamos la verdad y con valores.
Unite con nosotros a este video podcast donde vamos a hablar de todo, desde la fe hasta nuestras experiencias diarias.
En Decilo no hay filtros, el programa donde tu opinión cuenta.
Todos los viernes a las 6:30 de la tarde por Conectados con Dios y los sábados a las 6 de la tarde por Canal Antigua. No te lo pierdas.
Estamos de vuelta en esta entrevista especial. Nos está acompañando Gary Palmer, él es congresista de Estados Unidos. Diego, continuemos.
Taking the conversation where we last finished, you were talking about China and its impact on the U.S. economy. Guatemala is the last stronghold in Central America to still have relationships with Taiwan. What has been your personal experience with China, and do you have a word of warning from the U.S.-China politics?
Well, I think China is the existential threat to the West. China is using what we call debt diplomacy in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and South America in particular. They're building infrastructure, and a lot of countries are struggling now to make their debt payment. We saw Zambia and Sri Lanka go into default. Kenya, 72% of their debt is owed to China. Pakistan has a major debt issue, and it's all because they bought into this Belt and Road initiative that China was pushing. And there's a book that I would highly recommend. I don't know if there's a Spanish edition, but it's called The 100-Year Marathon. And it was Chairman Mao's vision for China to dominate the world. And Xi Jinping in China believes that he is the anointed one for achieving that. Well, that 100-year marathon is by 2049. It's just 25 years from now. And so they see themselves as the middle kingdom. That's not like the middle child. That's more like the sun, and everything else revolves around it. My concern is that as they do more of this debt diplomacy, more and more countries that are struggling to build out their infrastructure are going to fall into that debt trap, and they'll basically become vassal states. China has enormous needs for minerals. They have enormous needs for food, and they're going to have some enormous needs for water. We keep talking about in the U.S. about these advances in artificial intelligence, and all these data processing centers. Well, they require enormous amounts of water for cooling. So the whole world is changing. But I think we've got to be honest about the situation, look for other opportunities. And I'm not advocating a complete decoupling from China, but I think we need to become self-sufficient in so many areas, particularly in the area of critical minerals and rare earth elements, and our ability to make our own microchips and semiconductors to provide for our own energy needs. I mean, if Guatemala went 100% renewable, they'd be 100% reliant on China. When you have natural resources here to meet your needs, and our technology has advanced so much, and again, I told you I worked for 2 international engineering companies. We have the ability to mine what we need, to process it, refine it, make what we need without destroying our environment, but dramatically improving our quality of life. And Alabama, as I said, is an example of this, because in the 50s, my father and his brother moved to Michigan because there was no manufacturing in that part of Alabama. There was nothing to sustain that type of manufacturing. They worked for a company up there in a plant, saved their money, came back. But Alabama, in 1994, opened their first automobile manufacturing facility. Mercedes. We'd never had one in the state of Alabama. We now have Mercedes, Hyundai, Honda, Toyota, Mazda. We're building Airbus in Mobile, Alabama, building airplanes. We're building ships. That happened in 30 years, guys. I'm not sure you're 30 years old.
I'm not.
So, I mean, that's how quickly things can change if we make the right decisions, we invest in the infrastructure, and we do it the right way.
So there's this lesson from the whole Chinese experience that there's no free meal. But there are some other lessons that maybe we can learn as countries, since there's a lot of needs from countries like Guatemala, other Latin American countries, which China has identified and tried to supply those or solve those needs, maybe in the wrong way, right? But, for example, we've been talking here in the country about the role of the United States here in Guatemala. We receive a lot of foreign aid, and we don't seem to receive a lot of investments, business-wise, energy sector-wise. That's a lot of opportunities here. And we've experienced this whole international phenomenon of nearshoring, mainly because the U.S. doesn't want to depend from countries that are really far away from the U.S. and countries like China, for example, in manufacturing and other types of industries. So what can we learn from that experience? How can Guatemala be a strategic partner to the U.S. so that we can maybe manufacture some of those needs, and maybe that can stop or start to stop this illegal immigration, which is just people trying to find these opportunities that are not available here in countries such as Guatemala?
Well, there are a number of problems with government aid. First of all, it doesn't really create jobs except for the people in the government aid business.
Yeah.
It's helpful to meet needs for hunger, educational, healthcare, things like that. But it doesn't give you the infrastructure you need so that people can get better jobs, have higher incomes, have better housing, better access to healthcare, eat better. Those are the things that improve healthcare. And you know, I've said some things that come across fairly negative about China, but China was really smart about how they went about building out their economy. In the 1980s, they made a major investment in building out their power grid. They did it with coal-fired power plants, which I think that was not necessarily good. They should have gone with natural gas, but they don't have natural gas. They have coal. But they started in the 80s to do that so that they could attract manufacturing, provide cheap power, cheap labor. They built out their manufacturing, and from 1990 to 2020, they raised over 25%, a quarter of their population out of poverty in the middle class, and added almost 8 years to their population's life expectancy. India's doing even better. We should be looking at doing the same things in Latin America, but you're not going to do it in 4 or 5 years. The other problem with government aid is it depends on the government, and governments change. They come and go. If we could get private investment in a collaborative manner between private investors in the U.S. and Canada and Europe, working in collaboration with private investors in country, in Guatemala and other Latin American countries. And the government basically create the framework that protects private property rights, has reasonable and predictable regulations and taxes. Then I think you could see some things change. But it will take a while for you to get to the place they need to be. And again, using Alabama as an example, this explosion in automobile manufacturing, we're now one of the top manufacturing states in the world, and it happened in 30 years.
Well, that's interesting. So one of the underlying subjects of your interventions has been the role of the private sector in economic growth and in these types of benefits that these countries have experienced decades ago. Do you believe there's been a certain narrative against the private sector, the businessmen, not only in your country, here in Guatemala, or all over the world, about trying to expand the government more and reduce the role of the private sector in the economy, in society, in the family? And maybe then we can talk about certain family values and everything else. But do you think there's been a really critic narrative about the role of the private sector?
Marxist narrative, Jose.
Yeah.
That the people who own the companies in the private sector only want to exploit the people. That's the wrong narrative. It was someone in the private sector who was willing to invest in companies where I was able to get a job. And the thing about working for a company in the private sector is if you don't like your job, you can quit your job. But if you're dependent on the government, you have nowhere else to go. It's about control. And, it was said, I think it was Milton Friedman said it, but I'm not sure. But there was this statement that whoever has the ability to give you everything you want has the ability to take away everything you have. That's the government. That's why the private sector approach is much better. When you have private sector come in and create jobs, it gives people to earn more money than they need, to live. Right now you have people who earn enough to subsist. But when you can earn more than that, gives you ability to save, gives you the ability to invest in your own creativity, your own vision. That's the message of America. Is these private arrangements created a huge growth in small business ownership. I didn't tell you the rest of the story of my father.
Yeah.
He, like I said, 8th grade education, was in the woods using a chainsaw and skidding logs with mules. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. After I went, my brother, who's a year and a half younger than me, went. My sister went. Well, while we're in college, Dad stopped logging, and with his brother, took the money that saved and started a small business. And it completely changed everything. My mom had finished high school. Because Dad was making sufficient money, she was able to go to college and get a nursing degree. My youngest brother's 12 years younger than me, finished the top 10% of his engineering class, was a civil engineer. That's what could happen in this country and other countries. But it takes time, and it takes people who are investing in the infrastructure and in the construction of businesses that give people a chance to come and work and really make more than a subsistence wage, but make money that allows them to prosper.
Let's talk a little bit about personal values, and I think you touched on a number of issues that have to do with personal values transcending into politics. What is the purpose of the National Prayer Breakfast in the United States? How has it impacted your life, and what do you hope it achieves in Guatemala?
Well, I'm a Christian, and that's the thing that defines my worldview. And as a Christian, I think if you're really committed to your faith, you're other-oriented. It's not just about you. I think of the Apostle Paul, and if you read the first chapter of Philippians, and Paul was a preeminent scholar as a Jewish scholar. I mean, he was in the elite, but he gave it all up, and he found himself in prison. And he's writing this letter to the church at Philippi, and he talks about how the fact that he's in prison, it has given him the ability to advance the gospel. And then he says something about how his chains, he was in bondage, his chains has actually been instruments to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when I read that, it made me stop and think, well, what am I bound to? Because we all bind ourselves to something. I'm either bound to my faith, or I'm bound to my government, or I'm bound to my own ideas of what I want to do in terms of making money or whatever. And that's really what I think your leadership ought to be focused on, is that they're not bound to the government, they're not bound to money, they're bound to service Jesus Christ. And when you are, you're other-oriented. You care about other people, and you care about their faith, first of all, their eternal future, but also about their well-being. And you read the Second Chronicles, and talking about, it's the part about a cheerful giver. Well, what was the purpose? It was to meet the needs of people who were going through a famine in Israel. And he said, you do this not only to meet the need, but that they might glorify God in the receiving of these gifts. Well, if the government did it, I don't know how many times government aid has resulted in people getting on their knees and thanking God. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I really think that's the thing that in Congress we have quite a few Christians. We could use some more. But I'm in 2 Bible studies, one on Wednesday morning, one on Thursday morning, and with people who are serious about their faith. That's the framework through which we make our decisions. And I think it's extremely important to have that in your government, because if someone's bound to Jesus Christ, then they're not as bound to the politics or to self-service that leads to corruption. And it gives you an ability to really do things that help people. And that's largely one of the reasons why I'm here, is I don't see Guatemalans as Guatemalans. I see them as part of the family of God. And I've been in Africa, I've been in South America, I've been in Europe and Asia, and I was in Ghana and met Christian after Christian, and it just reminded me of what it says in Matthew chapter 19, verse 29, that whoever gives up fathers and mothers and homes and lands for my sake will have 100-fold of homes and lands in this life and in the life to come. So wherever you go, where there's Christians, you got family.
That's right. Well, we're reaching the final part of this interview. Congressman, thank you for joining us on this occasion. Is there any message would you like to send to the Guatemalan people who are listening to this interview? Or even, I don't know, if some U.S. people might listen to this interview here. Is there any short message you would like to send them?
Well, I just want them to be encouraged that there are people in the U.S. who view Guatemala differently than what you might hear in the media and what you might hear from some politicians. We don't view Guatemala like an aggressor nation would to try to dominate your country and tell you how to live your lives. We see you as allies. And this is a message that I'll take back to my colleagues in Congress, that they need to come to Guatemala. We need to find a way to meet the needs that the people of Guatemala have, so they don't have to leave a place they love. That's one of the things that I found just in the day and a half that I've been here, is there's an enormous love for this country among its people. And like I said, my brother and his uncle left northwest Alabama to go to Michigan. They left their family, left their friends, everything familiar to them, to go to a place that honestly was strange to them. That's what's happening with people who migrate. And I think if we can help Guatemala build out their infrastructure, provide the energy resources that they need to support manufacturing. There will be no near-sourcing if you can't have the manufacturing to make it here. Then you'll have a place where people don't need to leave. Maybe a place where people want to come to from other countries. So that's what I hope comes out of this.
Thank you very much, Congressman Gary Palmer, who joined us on this occasion. Y gracias, Diego, también por acompañarnos en esta entrevista especial. Ha sido un gusto compartir escenario aquí contigo. Y gracias a toda la audiencia que también nos acompañó en esta entrevista especial. Los invitamos siempre a seguirnos en las redes sociales de Canal Antigua y estar pendientes de este tipo de entrevistas que hacemos de vez en cuando. Un saludo a la audiencia y nos despedimos.
Muchas gracias.